Hello and welcome to this edition of C++ for Absolute Beginners. Today we are going to be talking about the if statement. So as you can see here, I have a program opened in Visual Studio, and to start off I have three variables: average, total, and how many. And as you can see below that, we have a formula here where we are dividing total by how many to get an average, and we're storing it in the variable average. And then we're printing that out. Now, this can be kind of problematic here, because what if how many were to have the value of 0? We would be trying to divide total, which has the value of 30, by 0, and try plugging that into a calculator. Divide 30 by 0, you'll get an error. We can't do division by 0, and the same applies here in programming. So how do we make sure that we never divide total by 0? Well, we can do an if statement. And what that looks like is we put the word if and then an open parentheses, and then we have a conditional statement. And here we're going to say, as long as how many is not equal to 0, then go ahead and calculate the average and print it. And notice how we have to put the curly braces there. And so we're going to put our block of code that we want executed in here. So right now, as it is, this block of code right here will not be executed because how many is equal to 0, and it's only going to execute this if how many is not equal to 0. Now, better yet, we could change this to if how many is greater than 0, meaning if it's positive. As long as it's a positive number, go ahead and calculate the average. So say that if how many is not a positive number, we want to go ahead and print a message for the user. So we would simply go below our if statement and put else. And then what we can do is put a cout statement. Okay, so now it's going to print a string that says that the variable how many is not greater than 0. And notice how I didn't put open and curly braces here for the else statement. That's because we only have one line of code that we want to execute, whereas up here we have two lines. So a rule in C++ is that if you have one line of code to execute in an if-else statement, you can omit those curly braces. But more than one, you have to have those curly braces to signify that there's a block of code that you want to execute. So let's go ahead and execute this as it is with how many equal to 0, and so we should get it to print this message. And there we go, it says variable how many is not greater than 0. So let's go ahead and give how many the value of 5 and see what it does then. And there we go, we get the average is 6. So because it was greater than 0, it went ahead and entered this block of code here and calculated the average and printed that. And it skipped over this else statement because this condition here was true. So it did this, and then it completely jumped out of this if-else statement. Its job is now done. But say we want to add another clause in there where if how many is equal to 0, we want to print that. We want to print a message saying that the variable how many is equal to 0. Well, all we have to do is add an else if statement in there. And then another conditional statement saying if how many is equal to 0, then print that how many is equal to 0. Otherwise, it gets to this else statement, and we know that the number is negative because, first of all, it wasn't greater than 0, and then we check to see if it was equal to 0, and so now we know that it's a negative number. So we also want to change that to where the message displays that the variable how many is a negative number. So what it would now do is check how many. If it's greater than 0, it would go ahead and execute this code here. Otherwise, it's going to go down here to this else if statement, and it's going to check if how many is equal to 0. If it is, then it'll print this line of code. Otherwise, it'll just go ahead and default to this line of code here, where it will go ahead and print this line. Let's go ahead and set this to 0 and see if it prints this line here. And there we go. Variable how many is equal to 0. And then let's change it to -3. And go ahead and execute that. And there we go. Variable how many is negative. So this was our first if-else statement. Now just keep in mind, in order to start one of these things, you have to start it off with if. And then what you can do is have an else at the very end as your default, and in between you can have else if, but those also require a conditional statement like the first if does. Or we could even just have one if statement on its own. You don't even have to have the else or the else if statements. So that's just an introduction. And in the next tutorial, we're going to cover how to do nested if statements. So with that said, I hope to see you in the next video. That concludes this tutorial.